Hello and welcome to the Stories That Matter event series, brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Masters of Film and Media program and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Academy Award winner, director, and writer Travon and writer and curator Angela N. Carroll. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MA in Film and Media playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the Masters of Film and Media Program Director, Mr. Tim Perrell.
Thank you, Peter. And you actually covered almost everything I was going to cover, so thanks for that. Just one quick reminder, though, there will be time at the end of this conversation for questions, and definitely please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Let me just take a quick minute to introduce our guests here today, and then I'll disappear. Angela Carroll is a Baltimore-based artist, archivist, writer, curator, and investigator of art history and culture. You can read her work, and I really encourage you all to do so, in places such as Sugarcane Magazine, Black Art in America, Be More Art, and Hyperallergic. And at the end of last year, Angela released Exploring Presence, African-American Artists in the Upper South, which is a catalog and short docuseries that surveys under-recognized artists in the DMV region. And this spring, there'll be an Exploring Presence exhibition that's going to premiere at the James E. Lewis Museum of Art at Morgan State University. Thank you, Angela, for being here and leading this conversation. And on a personal note, thank you for the dozens of emails, conversations, and coffees we've had over the past few months as we've discussed this event. I really appreciate your partnership in this. And also joining us today is Academy Award-winning and two-time Emmy Award-winning writer and stand-up comedian Travon. Travon wrote and co-directed his first short film, Two Distant Strangers, which won him the Oscar for Best Live Action Short. And Travon is currently writing a feature script starring Idris Elba for Apple. And before that, Travon was supervising producer on Wilmore, supervised on Harlem, the Tracy Oliver Project at Amazon. He was a writer on the HBO series Showtime about the LA Lakers in the 1980s, which I am looking forward to. Was a producer on Black Monday for Showtime, was a producer on the Lena Dunham, Jenny Conner HBO series Camping. And he got his start at The Daily Show, both with Jon Stewart and Trevor Noah, as well as Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. So Travon, thank you so much for taking the time to participate today. I'm looking forward to this, and I'm going to turn this over to Angela. Thank you.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Just so beautiful to be alive and be here, and really excited to be in conversation with you, Travon. Have seen a lot of your work, and I'm really, inspired and encouraged, whenever I view it. Want to jump right in and talk a little bit about sort of what initially sort of inspired you, right, to go into writing and into this industry at large. And I think a lot about how the first film, right, in our nation is Birth of a Nation, right? And the ways in which this film is significant in that it is bringing, the silver screen to communities all over the country and all over the world. But I also think a lot about how the first monster, right, that we see, that the world sees, is free Black people, right, and especially and particularly free Black men. And so what I really love and appreciate about the projects that you have created, which are pretty vast, right, always offer different perspectives about Black experience. And so if you can share a little bit about kind of what initially inspired you to go into this industry, as a writer, as a producer, as a director.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's such a great question. For me, I was a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid. I was really young. I just loved writing. And it was the thing I did on the side of like playing basketball, being an athlete. And I never, growing up in Compton, in a city like Compton in the 90s, and even early 2000s, it's not a place where you're pushed to be a writer or those kind of things. You know what I mean? It's not a place where storytelling in that way, we tell stories through music. Like Black people tell stories through music. It's what's you play, like, right, we have a lot of rappers from Compton and things like that. And so I didn't even know that I could be a storyteller in this way until I got to college. And so it wasn't until high school and maybe like late junior high when my English teachers were starting to tell me like, hey, you're like really good at writing. You should really focus some attention to the skill that you have. Because for me, it was just a means to get good grades to play basketball. Like I had to get good grades. So it's like, if I do well, I get to play. And so one year, my junior year of high school, my English teacher pulled me aside after class and she was like, look, you need to really, like, you have this skill, you should pay attention to it. It's something you probably don't necessarily notice, and I didn't. I just did my work and I turned it in. But I knew I loved to do this thing. And so once I got to college and I had a basketball scholarship to Long Beach State, and my sophomore year, I had knee surgery and I was out for a year and a half. And in that time, I took some film classes and some writing classes, and I took a comedy class and that my university offered. And it was when I discovered that this was a thing you could do for a living, and that like the craft of storytelling could be honed and used, in the way that I've been trying to use it. And that was so new to me. I didn't know that was, you watch TV, you watch movies, but it's only in certain communities where they're being told, you can be the one to make those. You can be the one to do that. Because, Black people are very, we're in front of the camera, we're performers. We're the ones who've through our history from slavery to now have been very vocal, active, performing people. And so in an industry like this that's built so heavily on white ownership and white leadership, you don't learn that you can also do this too. Like you can tell stories, there's a space for you, because there really wasn't. And so once I discovered that was a thing that I could do, it just like, it took over my mind. It took over, it changed the direction in which I wanted to go with my life. When, I recovered from my knee surgery and played my last year at college, as soon as I was done, I was like off to the races. Like, I want to do this. I want to do stand up, and I want to tell stories, whether it's standing up and telling them or putting them on paper to get them on screen. This is what I want to do. And so there's obviously no guarantee that you'll find success in that, and most people don't. It's just like, it's like any other like high stakes, very subjective creative field. You just have to do the best you can and hope you break through. And I just committed myself to it in a way that I didn't want to give myself an out. And so in doing that, it put a great amount of pressure on me to, at the very least, work harder than most people. And so that was kind of what pushed me into the position to then take the stories that I had been carrying around in my life from where I grew up and what I was experiencing in the places that I was inhabiting, to find a way to put that out into the world, and how I could bring that unique experience to writers' rooms and to different shows and to film. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the writer's room, because we know that these spaces, like much of the film that the world is exposed to from America, are not very diverse, right? And it seems that it's also very difficult, right, for writers with different perspectives, coming from different backgrounds, to enter into those spaces and offer those perspectives, right? Not just be a kind of character who only writes about Black people, right? In that sitcom or show, or film, right? So can you talk a little bit about, the ways in which you have been able to create really dynamic you know, shows and films. Like I'm thinking, you know, you have Two Distant Strangers poster in the background, right? With we know one of the dopest MCs, right? Joey Bad, right? Like
Right.
um this really that really blends, right, social horror and sci-fi, and this notion of sort of being trapped in a loop, um, and to help us think about the redundancy of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. And so one would imagine that it would be very difficult to make a film like that, you know, in this moment, or potentially prior to this moment.
Yeah.
But then you balance that with, you know, writing basic comedies, you know, like Harlem, you know, contributing to, you know, that really beautiful series, or
Yeah.
doing, you know, working on the Wilmore show, or the Daily Show for so many years, right? Where, so can you talk a little bit about how you were able to situate yourself in these writers' rooms and make space for the types of stories that you wanted to be told?
Definitely. So for me personally, I think I'm the best I can be for someone else when I'm working for someone else or writing for someone else by being strong and firm in what I believe and my perspective, but being broad in what I know, right? And so I try to read and watch as much as I can outside of my own bubble, my own mind, my own perspective. What can I add onto myself that I wouldn't normally find or wonder my way into based on what I know, believe, and love and think. And so it's allowed me to shift gears and write and produce for so many different types of shows, because when I go to Harlem, I'm immersed in the female Black experience, right? And so now I have to shift gears into, well, what is my mom and my sister's life like? And what have I learned from their experiences? What have I learned from the Black women around me, my Black female friends? And what do I, as a man, a queer Black man, what can I bring to this experience, to this room? And it's in understanding that and understanding how to unpack that, it, like, that room required uh, uh, delicacy. It required understanding something outside of yourself that you don't experience, because I don't have the experiences of the women who were in our room, which was, I was the only man, the only Black man, especially in the actual writer's room. Our showrunner, our co-showrunner was male, but he was like, him and Tracy were off like doing the thing in the actual room. I'm the guy sitting there with like 7 Black women trying to figure out how to tell this story, right? And so then you go from there to a show like Camping with Jennifer Garner and David Tennant, and you're telling a very different story, and you have a biracial actor who's a character who's, you know, has biracial parents, and then you have Janixa Bravo's character who is a Black woman married to a white man, and they have their own issues. And so every one of these things presents a unique challenge, but it opens you up to explore like what it is you know about not only the world outside of yourself, but how do you bring yourself to those things? How can you color this thing with the things that you know? And so it I never wanted to be one thing. That was the thing that was so huge for me. And I still, it's a thing that my manager's embraced so well about my career, and he understands it so well, is like, you can't just send me one type of project. Like, I get so many different types of projects pitched to me, and they're all interesting for different reasons. And so when you look at the body of work, there isn't going to be 17 horror films or like 17 of the same things. Like, everything I want to do is interesting to me specifically for a certain reason. And I love being able to keep myself from being put into a specific box. And so when I think of when I did Two Distant Strangers, people were surprised that I would write something so dramatic, because my background was comedy. And I would have to tell people, you know, the foundation of comedy is drama. like in order to write good comedy, you have to understand the drama underneath it. And so that was why I really enjoyed working on what is called now Winning Time on HBO, the Lakers drama, because it allowed me to flex a muscle that I knew I had, but I'd never gotten an opportunity to actually do. And so those are the things that have carried me from a daily show to Full Frontal, where you go from a very male-centric late night political satire show to a very female-centric late night political satire show, and why I can move from all these different spaces, because that's the most interesting thing to me, is how can I be as open as I possibly can, and how can I know myself well enough to bring it to these spaces where it wouldn't normally be, because most writers' rooms are still white, are still mostly white. And not even like, and I'm talking like 90%, nearly 90%. And you still hear people complaining that a Black person got a job on a show and not them, which is insane. And so while on the face, it looks like, oh, we've made so much progress in TV and film, you look at the numbers and we haven't. Like, we haven't. What we're doing is we're just putting their faces in your face more. You see the ones who made it way more, but you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And in actuality, it's just not a lot. And so I've used my skill set to just like kick open as many of those doors as I can, and to do as many different things as I can, because we contain multitudes. Like, we as Black creators and Black writers and Black directors, we are not just one thing. And you look at the landscape of white writers and white directors, and they can do anything. They can do anything they want, and they're never questioned about it. But if you are a Black comedy writer and you try to write a drama, people go, why are you doing that? Like, this is your thing is this, right? It's like, no, I should have the same freedom to move as anybody else. And so that's the biggest thing that I'm like pushing for and trying to like keep rolling for myself and for other people.
Yeah, and I think that work is so important, right? Like, I mean, I think you're doing that work. Ava DuVernay, right, is doing that work in really tremendous ways, and so you said something about sort of like the numbers, right? And so I want to think about that and stick with Ava DuVernay for a second, and think about her new project, Naomi, right? And for those that are not familiar, Naomi is based on a graphic novel. It's a sci-fi sort of YA story of a young girl who realizes that, you know, she has some powers, and is figuring out how to work with those, figure out her own origin story. And it has a young Black female protagonist as the lead. So it is really shifting and altering the sort of superhero genre in really dynamic ways. And I think it was hoping that it would be able to exploit the same target group that was watching the Supergirl genre on the CW. But apparently, you know, these numbers were very disappointing as far as like viewership for the first few episodes of this show. And so one wonders how easily a show can get greenlit, and how based on those numbers, it can potentially prohibit other shows like it from getting off the ground. And so can you talk a little bit about your experience being, you know, from the perspective of a producer, a writer and a director, how these numbers and ratings really affect in real time new opportunities for Black creative ventures to move forward?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely been an ongoing thing for Black creators, because we know Hollywood already doesn't lean toward Blackness, right? And so when when we know from talking to people, and you know, people's emails being leaked and things of that nature, that people don't have a high believability in pushing Black projects, because they don't think that they'll do well. When in actuality, a big part of why they end up not doing well sometimes is because of how they're treated by an all-white leadership, an all-white studio group. And so if you don't understand what you're selling, of course you're not going to have a good turnout. You're not going to have a good return rate on that particular thing if you don't understand, if nobody on the team understands what you're doing. And so when you have a show who is an opportunity to have Black and brown voices on TV in front of and behind the camera, and then it underperforms, there's so many factors that go into why it underperformed and what does it mean to the studio or network. And a lot of times the underperforming show is not performing any worse than the other 7 white shows on the network that are on their 4th or 5th season. It's just that it provides an opportunity for the studio to go, see, we tried and nobody watched it. Or sometimes you'll hear people go, you guys didn't want to watch that when we made that show and you guys didn't even want to watch it. And there's so many other reasons why it didn't get watched, or it wasn't found by the right audience, or how it was promoted, or how little it was promoted, which happens a lot. And so you end up having to fight all these battles of not only getting your show on the air, getting your show made, which is already so hard to do. Like, taking race out of it, it's already insanely hard to get a TV show made. Then when you factor in who the show is for, who's making the show, you add in all these other factors, whether they're conscious or unconscious biases that prohibit that thing from succeeding or prohibit that thing from getting a second chance. Like, for example, Seinfeld took 2 or 3 seasons to become Seinfeld. The first 2 seasons, the ratings weren't great at all. But they allowed him to keep making the show, right? To keep trying until the show found its footing. And that's not a thing we're often afforded as Black and brown creators, where you get a second chance or a third chance to kind of find your footing. And I can name a bunch of shows, a bunch of really popular, successful, white created, mostly white produced shows that are huge hits, but in the first 3 or 4 seasons were struggling hard. But people kept pushing. And we don't get that same push. We don't always get that same push in return. Very rarely do we get that same push in return. And I think it's fundamentally grounded in the fact that when you go to a studio and you look at the leadership from the top down, you got to go pretty far down before you find a Black person with any power, let alone the power to greenlight or create anything, which is, I think there might be 2 Black people in all of Hollywood who have green light power. And I think I know both of them. And so it's like maybe 3. And look at the number of studios there are. Look at how much content's being made every single year. And only 2 or 3 people of color in the entire business have the power to decide you get to see this show or you get to see this movie. And so what does that tell you about the landscape? How does that shape what not only what people see, but what they think about the people they see, because the type of projects that are being made. You look at all the drama around Licorice Pizza, for example, and how it treated Asian characters. And you're like, it got a bunch of Oscar nominations today because the people who got to decide whether that movie was treated the way it was were not mostly Asian people. And so they don't have to care about those things in the same way. It can be overlooked. And so that's how we find ourselves as Black creators looking at numbers like, oh, Naomi doesn't perform well. Does this mean like my show's gonna get canceled? Whereas other people were like, well, they'll probably give me another shot. We can figure it out. And I think once we get to a place where of the, I think, 400 and some odd shows that are produced on television every year, scripted shows, you think about it, there's that many shows on TV every year. How many of them can you actually name, right? How many of them are nominated for Emmys, right? Out of the 400 or so, maybe the same 7 shows take up all the nominations. And most times, year after year, the same shows, right? So Succession, Ted Lasso. Now you have Hacks, and there's almost 500 shows. But how many of those, when you look at the numbers, the majority of those shows aren't made by people of color. And yet the overwhelming majority of them are just average mediocre shows. So we're not even allowed to make average shows. We have to make exceptional shows every time out. We have to hit a home run every time out for us to exist in the space where we can create things and control things in spaces that are highly visible, your HBOs, your Netflixes, your Hulus and Showtime, like in the spaces that actually matter to people. And until that changes, until we're allowed to have average shows on TV, we have a long way to go.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, it's like a Sisyphean, like battle, just pushing this stone, up the hill constantly, and having potentially all of that lead fall backward based on the numbers of
Yeah.
one entity, which is insane. I want to talk about a few other, really popular shows that are out right now, and kind of this genre of, again, like social horror, which I think has been really powerful for us, again, looking at the ways in which the normalization of violence against people of color has been popularized, right, is an American trope, and a tradition, a ritual, really, a cult is what it is. And but also it has created a kind of a normalcy of showing very overt violence, very graphic violence against Black bodies within those shows, used as a kind of teaching tool, right? To say, look how horrible racism is, in the hopes that it will possibly deter that violence from happening, which is a strange kind of logic, right? Because violence against Black bodies has been popularized since the beginning of cinema, as we started off our talk
Right.
with, and it has done nothing to educate people to not participate in that violence. And so I'm curious if you think, and there have been a lot of films that have kind of played with this notion of social horror in other ways as well, right? Jordan Peele with Get Out and Us, Nia DaCosta with the new version of Candyman, which I thought was really tremendous. Terrence Nance with Random Acts of Flyness, who just is doing a really witty job as well. Lovecraft Country, I think, is one of, the most dynamic and more popularized shows that did this with Misha Green. Was really disappointed that a second season of that.
That was really disappointing.
Right. And which is a whole other sort of conversation, right? About why that didn't happen. But then, on the flip end of that, we have a show like Little Marvin series Them, right? That is just, many of the people who I talked to who watched it said that it was so violent, right? And so like, why did they have to do that? That they couldn't even get through the series. And so I have questions about whether you have any concerns with this kind of trend where we're saying, hey, we're greenlighting all of these shows that are featuring Black people, but all of them are also still centering slavery, white violence,
Yeah.
and somehow a kind of sacrificial martyrdom that shows the constant perseverance of Black struggle against that violence. Do you see that as something that should be concerning, or do you see it as a kind of means through which we can, review Black experience?
I think, it's such an interesting topic and question, and I think it's Black creators and the Black audience are having this moment where we have to meet ourselves somewhere, right? So Black creators are finally getting a chance to tell the stories they want to tell, even as few of them as there is who get to do it. And Black audiences have, like any audience, has a wide variety of things to pick from to pay their attention to or their money for, right? And with the social horror shows and films, and even films like mine, where you are telling a story through the lens of violence against Black people, there is, I think, a necessity for it, but I think there is a way in which it needs to be done, if that makes sense. And so I think what's difficult is it's hard to tell any creator. You can't tell your story. You can't tell that story for whatever reason. Separate from like a white person trying to make a movie about a Black person or the Black experience, you have no idea what you're doing, that kind of thing. But in terms of just a thing that's true to you, I have a lot of friends who, Jewish friends who we talk about the way cinema talks about Nazis and the Holocaust, and the way that like works within their community. And I remember specifically asking, like, how does it feel that every year there's multiple films, be them shorts, documentaries, features, that are retelling or still telling this story about this horrific thing that happened to your community? And my initial instinct, my like hypothesis was that, you know, like, maybe you guys are like tired of seeing the thing put back to you. And so to my surprise, they were like, absolutely not. They, like, one of my friends who's a producer, a big producer, he said, it's a thing that for our community was so horrific that we take never forget so seriously, that every time the story is retold by someone else through a different lens, through their version of the story, or whatever artist wants to tell that story, we don't necessarily watch them all, but we're grateful they exist, because it's reminding people in perpetuity to never forget, right? And so we, as Black storytellers, are finally getting the chance to even remotely tell our story, to express our pain through our artwork, right? And so it looks like there's a big convergence of stories that center around our experience and our trauma. And what's ironic about that is when you become a storyteller, when you become a writer, you become a director, you go to school for it, the first thing they tell you is to tell a story about your experience, your real life experience. And what is the experience of most Black people? You know, the average Black person in America is a story of mistreatment, a story of some form of pain, some form of trauma. Even if you've gotten yourself to be a successful doctor or lawyer or professor, where you came from probably most likely wasn't the glamorous suburbs, and your parents had money and you never struggled. So if you're saying, hey, here's a chance to tell your story, what do you want to talk about? Well, my truth is I get to be cathartic with this horrible experience that I might have had, or this painful experience that I internalize every day through society, where, like, I remember seeing the Amir Locke story a couple of days ago, and it immediately reminded me of my movie and the loop that we go through, because I felt those same feelings all over again as when I heard Brianna's story. And you're like, it doesn't end, right? And so I think it's, as creators, we have to be responsible with how we portray the things we portray. We have to know when, if I'm creating a scene where someone dies or something horrific happens to a Black person, when is enough enough? Or like, where is the line for me, for the people that I'm making this movie for, and who it's for? Who is the audience for this film? Is it Black people? Is it white people? Am I trying to send a message to someone else? Am I preaching to the choir? And am I doing that thing where I'm putting out into the world, I'm documenting my experience. I'm documenting the experience of my people because I finally have a chance to. So in the pantheon of cinema, you get to the 90s and you start to see John Singleton movies, and you start to see Spike Lee movies in the 80s, where you finally are getting movies about the Black experience, both love, positive, and Boys in the Hood, and things like that are a bit more violent and a bit more true to life. Like, Boys in the Hood looks like where I grew up. I saw drive-by shootings myself multiple times. Like, I've seen people die. And so when I see a movie like Boys in the Hood, it's not surprising or off-putting. It's, oh yeah, that is a movie of my experience that I never would have seen had John Singleton not been able to show the world what it's like to grow up where I grew up, if that makes sense. And so it's also, for Black people, I think, pushing us to deal with our pain and trauma so that on some level, seeing these things put back to us doesn't feel the same way. It doesn't have the same level of uncomfort. It'll never be comfortable, but it won't sting like the first time every time, if that makes sense. And so I think that's what I mean by creators and the audience have to meet each other somewhere, because it's both irresponsible, I think, to say Black creators shouldn't tell stories like Underground or Them, but it's also irresponsible to say that audiences shouldn't have a limit and shouldn't have a ceiling of what they can absorb and what they can take. And I think we're just in the middle of it. I don't think we've reached a solution or found or turned that corner to where that answer lies. I think we're experiencing it now, because you have Jordan Peele and Barry Jenkins and these brilliant filmmakers telling these stories. And I think we are still finding our way through it as creators. But I think it's dangerous to also, which I've seen people do, to tell Black creators, don't tell this story, because you are then, what story are you telling? You're doing the job of the people who don't want you to talk about it anyway, right? You like the people who want you to forget your history, the people who want you to forget where you came from, the people who want the books banned and who don't want critical race theory talked about in school. You're doing the work for them, because it's our way of being like, you can ban the book, but you can't keep this movie from existing. And you can't keep this story from being told. And so people will find the truth eventually.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah.
That's the hope, right? Want to pause for a second to remind folks that, your opinions, your thoughts, your questions are really important to this dialogue, this discourse as well. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box that you all should have access to, not the chat. We won't be checking the chat for your questions, but we will be checking the Q&A box. Feel free to put those in, and then we'll be, looking at those in the next few minutes or so. I've been rereading and rewatching a lot of like classic Black cinema, right? Like Bill Gunn's work has been especially, reverent for me, and thinking a lot about, the ways in which these thought leaders have pushed us forward, right? Continue to push us forward. Haile Gerima, as another keen example. Who are some of the, writers, directors, artists, even musicians, right? Like, who are influencing the stories that you're telling, the narratives that you're exploring, and the aesthetic that you're using to realize those stories?
Oh man, for me, Mike, I'm a child of the 80s, so I was born in 85. And when I really got introduced to film, my initial diet was Spike and John Singleton and just kind of, and Robert Townsend and the movies that were being watched in my house, and just that group of Black filmmakers at the time was very, very prominent for me. And as I got older, I was able to explore more, a more diverse diet of film and filmmakers, and the Wayans in television, and Keenan Ivory Wayans, the way he produced like everything, and what he did, for his family, and making everyone a household name. Those were the initial inspirations for, how I internalized what I could tell, what I could do in telling a story on screen. And that was kind of how I found, or where I felt like I got permission to be able to say whatever I wanted to say, because they were boldly telling these stories that they wanted to tell, and they were doing it in a way that was so new and so fresh and unique at the time. And so like now I'm so inspired by Barry and Jordan and Ava and Nia and all these brilliant filmmakers who are also I'm lucky enough to be friends with, to know them. and to be able to you know, try to learn from them and to better myself, to navigate this space and this world in a way that is so unique to our experience. I mean, I lean on Ava quite a bit, and she's like just like the best. Like if you got a question about what to do at anything, you call Ava, man. She will definitely steer you in the right direction, and she's definitely steered me in some very right directions. But the over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've started to kind of feel like I'm finding my own identity in terms of what type of filmmaker I want to be, what type of director I want to be, in the aesthetic of those stories. And I want to be able to tell a diverse range of stories. But the one thing that I think will carry through everything I do is, whether you love it or hate it, I want you to feel something. And the worst thing for me that anyone can do is walk away from something I may be indifferent. I take it or leave it. I don't like, I'd rather you hate it with the passion of 1,000 suns than to walk away from it and feel like it was, and so, because to me, that means I've done something. I've ignited, I've made you think about something. I've confronted you with something. And obviously we all want people to love what we do. And as artists, you're never going to get 100% buy-in on anything you do. That's just the nature of being an artist. It's the hardest part to accept for a lot of us as we continue to create, you know. Those detracting voices are so much louder than the ones that are telling you how great your thing is. But those are the people who shaped me and kind of propelled me into where I find myself now. I mean, John Singleton, I befriended a couple years before he died. You know, that was a huge loss. And I mean, there's not a lot of us. There's just not a lot of us. Matthew Cherry is another one who's like a big guiding light, big, like just talented, amazing person. And as a community, I think we need each other.
Beautiful. I want to jump into a few of these questions, and thank you to community who have contributed some really cool questions. I'm gonna start first with Brother Webster Phillips, who is an amazing photographer, runs the I. Henry Phillips Senior Archive, which catalogs thousands of images of Black history and culture from Baltimore. Really important archive. And he's asking, and this goes into a question that I had as well, just, you know, what are some films that you're excited about, right? That are maybe a little under the radar, unsung, but that we should learn about.
Any film or like Black film? I mean,
film shows, anything.
I can tell you there is a movie I was very happy to see get a few nominations today. This movie called The Worst Person in the World. Really fantastic film. I loved a lot of international movies this year. There's this film called A Hero. It's on Amazon Prime. Really fantastic film. There is Parallel Mothers, another fantastic film that came out this year. There's another wild one that Shaka King put me onto called Holy Motors.
That's a trippy film.
You saw it?
Yeah,
it's
years ago.
Trippy.
Yeah.
He was like, watch this movie and then let me know, call me and let me know what you think. No, that was a really surprising, like stuff like that can be inspiring in ways you just can never like anticipate. Seeing films like that, like how they get made. What else did I really love? It's so hard to remember what I've been watching because I'm always working, and I stop and watch something. but I've seen so many movies this year because of Academy voting. I mean, a lot of them, the international ones are probably more under the radar than the mainstream ones that you probably like could have saw at a theater. So Flea is also a fantastic animated documentary that is out now. Oh, what else am I forgetting? TV shows. I haven't watched any TV shows that I think you guys might not already know about. I mean, I just started rewatching Orphan Black, which if you haven't seen Orphan Black, watch Orphan Black. Like Tatiana Maslany's fantastic. She plays 7 characters in the same show. It's unbelievable. I just started rewatching that. What else under the radar that I've seen? Oh, there's this great movie called Plaza Catedral, like Plaza Cathedral, I think it's pronounced in English. Panamanian film. Oh, it was so good. And you'll probably like never hear of it. It was submitted for the Oscars. It made it to the short list, but didn't make it off. Really, really good movie. A movie with Javier Bardem called The Good Boss, another foreign film. Foreign films are great to watch, I think, for any film student or student of film, just because not only do you get to see what other people are doing, you get outside of like the American filmmaking bubble, because we consume the same things, we make films the same way for the most part, and it's so easy to get inspired by the great work that's going on outside of this country and outside of our like purview. So I really like, and Drive My Car. Like if you can see Drive My Car, just set aside 3 hours of your life and you'll understand why it got so many nominations today. It's a masterpiece. But yeah, I mean, also I'm gonna put out my list of everything I watched over the last like couple months soon, so you'll get to see the whole list. I'll put it on Twitter or Letterboxd or something.
Amazing. Okay, so you heard it here first. Look out, stalk his pages, his social media for all
Let's
of
do the full list of everything I can't remember right now.
Right, for all of the cinephiles. Jump into another question, really interesting question. I'm going to summarize it from Ashley Briscoe, who talks about there's a clip that was passed around of Matt Damon telling Effie Brown that having diversity behind the camera isn't as important. Obviously, Matt Damon isn't the only person who feels this way. And as you said, most people behind the scenes are not Black and may have the same idea. How do you work with people who have or may make these types of microaggressions when they have more power without letting yourself be tokenized? Thanks for that question, Ashley.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think the way you do that is, one, you have to be able to recognize when those things are happening, because it's very easy to be gaslit into thinking like what you're feeling or what you might be thinking is not actually happening when it's actually happening. And I think for me personally, the way you start a relationship with people when you're going into business with someone, you're making a movie, you're making a TV show, it's setting that table is going to be so important to preventing those things from happening, because it's what often happens sometimes for a lot of us is, as Black people and people of color, we can find ourselves being one or two of us on a project or in a room or that kind of thing. And what can end up happening is you kind of, to make sure you fit in or get in, you suppress a little bit of your self, whatever that self may be, whether it's your Blackness, your Asianness, your Latino-ness, whatever it is that sets you apart from the main part of the group, you try to like level it off so you fit in. Whereas like, if I'm in a room with all Black people, those rooms are so different than when I've been in a room where I was the only Black person. And so what ends up happening is people have a different comfort level around you, and they say things that they think are safe that they don't realize are offensive or a microaggression, and they think you're probably going to agree with it. And so if you let people know from the onset that, like, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and this is how I work, and you're also willing to walk away from that particular thing, which is a big thing for people, it will change those things. Because, like, the amount of times my managers has heard me say, I don't need this. I don't like, and not even when I like had, you know, money to make that decision. It was, this does not vibe with me as a person. What they're doing is wrong or unethical or whatever the case may be. I don't need, I'm fine to walk away from this. And when you say that to people, it changes. It's scary at first, but it changes the way they interact with you. It changes the way they behave toward you when they think you're willing to walk away from something. So then when someone does say something like that, you're able to challenge them on it. Because a lot of times people stay quiet. Because I've heard stories from writers. I'm on the WGA committee for a few different things, and you get these secret surveys of what's happened to people on the job and on sets. And so many people experience this stuff, and they go, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be fired, or I didn't want to be like, become the odd person out in the room because I was the only Black person, or I was the only Latino person, or I was the only Asian person. And it's really scary for new writers and new people in those positions, but you have to be willing to say something for it to stop. And it's something that I've done from the very beginning, where I wasn't afraid to sacrifice the job for myself and for what I knew would ultimately help other people of color in that same position. Because Matt Damon got that opinion from somewhere, and for him to say it so boldly on that video and to say it out loud, he was very strong in that belief that it didn't matter. And where did that come from? What do you think the sets that Matt Damon works on looks like primarily? Like, you're probably right. And that's probably where that comes from. And so it's up to us and how we are, when we find ourselves in the position, how we position ourselves, that can tamper that down and stop that from happening.
Yeah. We have two more really cool questions, but we are down to our last minute. So and I want to leave a little space for you to talk about new projects that you're working on, and also maybe hip us to your hat. But we'll start first with Sig Libowitz, who asked a really cool question, says that he was touched by your short film, Two Distant Strangers, I'm assuming is what he's referencing. And he asked, is there any part of the film that you struggled, that you had to maybe cut from the film, that you struggled with most and wish that you had kept? And also, what are you most proud of with the film?
What did I cut? You know what's funny is what's on screen is like 96% of what I wrote. And like that's hard to do even when it's your own thing. But there was the stuff that I cut just made it tighter. It just made it flow better. It wasn't anything other than what you really lost, what you guys really didn't see if you watched the movie, is just it's less jokes. There were some other funny moments in there that we just cut because we wanted the movie to be shorter, not because they made the movie worse or anything. It was like, that's funny, but it just like it's slow, like the movies, it slows us down. And so like we cut, there's a callback, actually, one of the things I did love that we cut at the end of the movie when they're at the table and he now knows what's going on. He does a callback to catching the bottle, and she mentions Odell Beckham Jr. again, and he goes on this run. Joey goes on this run about how amazing Jerry Rice was as a wide receiver, and he starts listing stats and like just trying to like get her to understand, like, you do understand, like, this guy is the greatest wide receiver of all time. It was a funny beat, but like, it just, if you were making a feature, fine, but like in that moment, ultimately we didn't need it. Like, it was funny, but like we could cut it. And there was a moment where in the beginning of the movie where, as he's going through his bag to get his wallet, she clocks his hand-rolled cigarettes, and they go on this back and forth about him smoking, and he's trying to quit, and talking about she clocks his roll of money. So it was the setup. Originally, it was the setup, the cigarettes and the money, which he ends up with outside. And they go on a run of jokes about that. And so after we watched a few cuts, we were like, the audience will be fine if we don't set up the fact that he already has this in his backpack, and we don't like need to acknowledge it. But at the time, it was just a funny run of jokes, but then it saved us a minute and a half kind of thing. And so there's nothing, was the last part of it, if there's anything I wanted to put back. No, I was very, very happy with the final product. I mean, to be honest, that film is almost entirely the first draft of the movie that I wrote.
That's amazing.
And that was just a product of the fact that I just internally, I just knew the story. But I had also been trained as a TV writer to write in that way. And so it didn't require a bunch of rewrites, because it was me telling a story I wanted to tell. It was my story. And all those things felt true to me. And so there was like little tweaks we made, like on the day, like where line reads were different, or like we changed. But like for the most part, if I go pull up draft 1 of Two Distant Strangers, you're going to read like 95% of what you saw in the movie.
Amazing. We had another witty question sort of asking about which shoes in your collection were your favorite. Unfortunately, we won't have time to talk about that. I think I'd pose the same.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I'm fine to answer whatever questions we have left. I got a few minutes, so.
Okay. Wanted to give you an opportunity to just share some of your projects. And I think also, and this kind of ties into another question that we had in the chat, where I think there's a presumption that if you make films that are about Black experience, that they are only for Black people, right? And I think that's something that affects a lot of the films that are able to be made, and it affects viewership of films that really are American stories, not even though they center Black, Brown, or Indigenous or Asian protagonists. And so can you talk a little bit about some new works that you are creating that, like many of the old works that you've created, that continue to kind of rupture that perception?
Yeah, I mean, the movie that I'm doing with Idris Elba at Apple is very much, it centers around 2 Black spies, or like a Black spy and whoever we cast as the other spy, which will probably be a person of color. But the movie itself is not just like, it's not like, here's a Black spy movie for Black people. It's like, no, here's a very like international big budget spy movie where the characters happen to be, the spies are people of color. And it's still for everybody. It still centers around universal themes of love and loss, and things that we all deal with, no matter what color you are. And so I feel like that's how, to me, that's the best way to create something that doesn't make people feel like, oh, this is just for them, so I'm not gonna watch it, like that kind of thing. Where it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm a Black filmmaker, so yeah, I'm making movies for Black people. I want Black people to watch my movies and my TV shows, but it's not just for them. It's for them in the sense that, like, hey, look, we're doing something, and it centers people who look like me. But that doesn't mean it's just for me, because for the duration of my life, I've watched movies and TV shows where everybody was white, and I still understood, and I still felt the same emotions, and I still connected when it was, you know, good and worthy of being connected to. And it didn't matter that the person was white. And so we can train people to understand that you can have a human experience no matter what color the person on screen is. And so it was a big deal for me to hear people say when they watched Two Distant Strangers when we were campaigning last year, that white people were telling me that they felt like they were Joey, that they were like, I saw myself in that character, like I was in his shoes. And that's how, when I knew, like, no matter what happened, we had done something right. We had done the thing we had set out to accomplish. And, you know, it's just like, just as much as like, I have so many influences of filmmakers of color, Black filmmakers, and you know, Latino. Alfonso Cuarón is probably one of my favorite directors in the world. Alejandro Iñárritu is one of my favorite. Like, these guys are, there's so many of them, but like Nora Ephron is one of my favorite filmmakers in the world. Like, I mean, I can't tell you enough how many times I've watched her movies. And because she was just a brilliant storyteller and great at making you feel things. And Richard Curtis is another one, one of my favorite filmmakers, who just made movies that made me feel something. And, you know, I take lessons from all these people and I apply them to my own filmmaking. And we can be grounded in something, but we can learn from everyone. And so that's kind of how I've pieced together my education in film, is like not limiting myself, but definitely, you know, cutting my teeth in where I grew up and what I grew up on. And so in that regard, I think the work is in expanding female filmmaking, and brought, like, because the fact that there's only been 2 women nominated for Best Director in the history of the Oscars is absolutely absurd. And I think of like people like Celine Sciamma, who every year makes a movie worthy of being nominated and never gets a nomination. And like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I don't care what you say, it's just like an incredible film.
A brilliant film.
Her movie, Girlhood, about the Black girls, just like, oh my God, like just another brilliant film. And so it's definitely where there's a lot of work to be done in that regard as well. And yeah, I think we just need to keep doing it. As far as my favorite shoes, it's probably my the Trophy Room Jordan 1s probably became the new favorite. Yeah, I'd probably say the Trophy Rooms. I've only worn them twice. They're very, very, very hard to find. They were given to me to wear on Jimmy Kimmel when I was on Kimmel last year. They are, I as much as I love them, I've only worn them twice because I don't want them to crease up and be all jacked up.
Spoken like a true collector. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and you know, really, I'm wishing you all the best of luck for everything that you continue to make.
Thank you, guys. And if anybody has any questions, I'm always checking Twitter and Instagram between Zooms and takes and any other thing that I kill time with. So shoot me a question or whatever. I'm happy to recommend any and everything that I'm consuming at any given time.
Excellent. So I guess we'll turn it back over to you, Tim.
Sorry, I was muted there. Yes, thank you both. That was absolutely terrific. Totally exhilarating. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Travon. Really grateful for your time and your insight. I agree with you. I think Flea is the best of all the foreign language movies this year. So I was glad you finally got to that one.
Yeah, Flea's a good one.
Yeah. But thank you both. And thank you all for coming and for contributing. And until the next time, appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.